In the United States, socialism and communism have become more popular in recent years. Last year, New York City elected self-proclaimed Democratic Socialist Zoran Mamdani to be city mayor. Several politicians and groups have risen to prominence on the basis of socialist communist principles. So many people have grown alarmed. There are consistently more and more people voicing worry and even panic. But we should not be worried, and in this video I will discuss 5 reasons why we shouldn't be. Here are 5 reasons why the United States will never become communist, based on historical precedents and analysis. Hi, this is Olivia's History Zone. Here, I analyze geopolitics, history, and just anything else that I find interesting. As a reminder, I make mistakes, so if I do, please respectfully indicate if I did so in the comments. Also, consider liking and subscribing. Now, on with the video. One major reason why the United States is highly unlikely to become communist is the absence of a unifying, charismatic, revolutionary figure capable of consolidating a fragmented movement into a single, unifying national force. Historically, successful communist revolutions were not spontaneous. They were centralized movements built around powerful central figures. Some examples are Vladimir Lenin in Russia, Mao Zedong in China, Fidel Castro in Cuba, Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, and Kim Il-sung in North Korea. And each of these men did several critical things. They unified ideological factions, centralized strategy and messaging, built disciplined party structures, and became symbolic embodiments of a revolution. The United States does not have this. In fact, the United States lacks this dynamic entirely. The American left is incredibly fragmented across progressive Democrats, democratic socialists, social democrats, labor activists, identity-based movements, and Marxists, and more. All of these groups have historically, and still do, disagree on reform, revolution, electoral participation, the role of capitalism, and even the meaning of socialism itself. Without a central leader to consolidate and discipline these factions, large-scale revolutionary cohesion becomes nearly impossible. Additionally, every figure that I have listed previously came from societies that traditionally placed power into one centralized figure. The Tsar in Russia and the Emperor of China are good examples. So, it was much easier for the general populace of these countries to accept another centralized leader. American political culture, on the other hand, resists centralized leadership and is largely distrustful of it. American political tradition is built on constitutionalism, federalism, and individualism. The United States was, after all, founded literally in rebellion against centralized authority. Historically, communist revolutions do not emerge from stable middle-class societies. Instead, they emerged in countries with mass, deeply entrenched poverty, usually where the majority of the population lived in extreme deprivation. For example, when the Chinese Communist Party came to power in 1949, some 70 to 80% of the Chinese population lived in poverty, facing famines and chronic food shortages. In Russia, in 1918, when the Soviets came to power, the country was experiencing extreme economic collapse as a result of World War I that greatly increased the poverty rate. Both China and Russia had majority poor and rural populations. Now, compare those cases to the United States. While poverty exists, it is not the majority condition, primarily rural, near universal, or accompanied by systemic famine and collapse. In history, communist revolutions take place in areas where a massive underclass has little to lose, wealth is concentrated in a tiny elite, and economic desperation was widespread and generational. The United States has poverty, but it also has a large middle class with broad home ownership, widespread consumer access, social mobility mechanisms, and welfare infrastructure. There are means to advance in the United States. And American poverty is different than in historic communist countries. Poverty is more urban than agrarian. Literacy is near universal. Free and fair elections are regular. And political participation is encouraged, legal, and institutionalized. A large middle class dampens revolutionary energy, which brings me to point number 3. Revolutionary movements succeed best when people feel excluded, systematically dispossessed, and economically trapped. Typically, communist revolutions succeed in societies where the population is sharply divided between a tiny, ultra-rich elite and a massive, impoverished underclass. In the United States, a large middle class owns homes, has retirement accounts, participates in the stock markets, and relies on private property protections, meaning that millions more people hold stakes in a non-socialist communist system, and the middle class has much to lose in a communist revolution. Homes, businesses, college degrees, careers, and investments. In a system constructed on abolishing or radically restructuring private property, threatens those assets and all of that hard work. Middle classes, historically, resist extremism. Countries with strong middle classes often channel discontent into reform, electoral shifts, policy adjustments, and the like. Middle class populations also more likely to be politically active. They tend to vote more often, are more civically engaged, more invested in stability, and more dependent on predictability. Whatever your thoughts are about the American dream, accurate or not, it reinforces individual effort, entrepreneurship, education as a means to advance and reform over revolution. Communist movements historically gain traction when the upward mobility feels impossible for an overwhelming majority, and in the United States, many still perceive mobility as achievable. Another major structural difference between the United States and many historical communist countries is the level and distribution of education. Successful communist revolutions occurred in societies with low levels of literacy, limited access to higher education, restricted political information, and a weak to non-existent independent media. Once again, we can look to the examples of Russia and China as precedents. On the eve of the Russian Revolution, large portions of the rural population had next to no formal education. Before the Chinese Communist Party took over, China had high illiteracy rates and very limited chances for advanced higher education. This made politics easier to centralize, revolutionary ideology was spread easier through simple class narratives, and ideological messaging faced far less competing analytical frameworks. By contrast, the United States has near universal literacy and widespread access to secondary and higher education, the latter of which tends to produce greater understanding of constitutional tradition, familiarity with economic pros and cons, awareness of historical cases, and exposure to multiple political ideas. While that does not eliminate ideological movements, it does make sweeping systemic overhaul harder to sell as simple band-aid solutions. Finally, we have number 1. Most every major communist revolution in the 20th century was rooted in agrarian, subsistence societies. Karl Marx, the writer of the Communist Manifesto, predicted that the working class of the industrialized countries of Europe, namely Britain and Germany, would rise up and create communist societies. He did not predict that the same would happen in agrarian societies. He turned out to be wrong. Instead, communism has historically mobilized landless peasants, rural tenant farmers, serfs or quasi-serf populations, and agricultural laborers under landlord systems in far less industrialized, mostly agrarian countries. The United States is overwhelmingly urban and suburban, not agrarian and rural. Every country to have a major communist revolution was backed and fomented by peasants. The Russian Revolution occurred with millions of peasants who were tied to the land and faced extreme inequality. The Chinese Communist Revolution was specifically built around mobilizing peasants against landlords. In both cases, the countryside provided manpower, agricultural inequality created large grievances, rural geographic organization, and the fact that state control in rural areas tended to be very weak. So, the peasant class became the backbone of revolutionary armies. Today, the United States is, in contrast, highly urban and suburban, with a very small percentage, less than 2%, actively engaged in farming. And modern American agriculture is mechanized, capital-intensive, corporate or family-owned, and highly productive with a small workforce, rather than subsistence level. Agrarian societies make different revolutionary dynamics. In agrarian societies, wealth inequality is highly visible, economic oppression is local and generational, making land redistribution a rallying cry. In industrial and post-industrial societies like the United States, wealth is financialized and abstract. Employment is diverse. The majority of Americans are employed in service-based industries as it is. People are economically interdependent across different sectors, and supply chains are complex, intertwined, and global, meaning that simple class-based mobilization is much harder. So there you have it. 5 reasons why the United States will likely never become communist. Thank you for watching. If you found this video helpful or insightful, like, subscribe, and leave a comment on your thoughts below. And if you have a video idea, let me know. I'll continue covering political and geopolitical issues with depth, context, and clarity.